Good evening and welcome to Zlipless Historian. You're in a quiet place now, made for slow stories, soft thoughts and peaceful sleep. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let the day gently fade away. Tonight, we'll explore the quieter side of history, simple lives, strange old customs, and forgotten moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. If this calm journey brings you peace or helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe. Only if it feels right. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Asterisk Story 1. The Royal Mirror, Beauty Standards and Grooming Rituals in the Middle Ages. Asterisk Faces, like ivory, brows, like threads. The medieval queen's morning mirror. Asterisk Lean close, but gently now. The fire crackles, low, not yet stoked for the day. Thin morning light leaks through the stained glass, scattering pale colors across the chamber wall. A servant steps quietly, holding a mirror of polished metal in trembling hands. The queen, still in her nightrobe, breathes slowly, eyes downcast, awaiting the ritual. Because beauty for a medieval royal woman was not effortless. It was deliberate, rehearsed, repeated, and recorded in poems, portraits, and whispered envy. This is not a tale of vanity, not quite. It is a story of discipline, of brushes and blades, powders and pastes, cloth and concealment. Tonight, or rather, this soft morning, we step into the Queen's mirror, and we look closely, but not too quickly. The details take time. The mirror, as ritual object, the medieval mirror, was not made of glass, not yet. Instead, it was a disc of polished silver or burnished bronze, sometimes convex, sometimes slightly cloudy, always precious. In the royal household, a mirror was more than a tool. It was a symbol of reflection in both the physical and spiritual sense. To look into it was to search not only for blemishes, but for worth, for symmetry, for favor. A queen might keep her mirror in a velvet pouch, opened only by her closest attendants. It was wiped daily with silk, rubbed with wine or vinegar to keep it clear, passed down through generations, as sacred as a prayer book. One 14th century French inventory describes Queen Jean's mirror as a disc of bright silver, no greater than an apple framed in ivory and etched with lilies. And yet, no mirror, however fine, was ever truly flattering. They showed every imperfection. And so the grooming began, cleansing the face, morning preparations before any paint or powder. The queen's face had to be cleansed. There were no soaps in the modern sense. Instead, cleansing was done with infused waters and milk-based rinses. Common cleansing ingredients: goat's milk, warmed and mixed with rose petals, rainwater, gathered from lead spouts and filtered through linen, cucumber pulp, mashed with sour wine, ground barley, mixed into a soft paste, witch hazel or chamomile infusions. Especially for sensitive skin, the queen's attendant would soak a linen square, wring it gently, and pat the queen's cheeks, forehead, chin. The goal was not only to clean, but to reduce redness, soothe blemishes, and prepare the face. For decoration, some queens preferred to apply a thin layer of honey and leave it for several minutes. A primitive facial mask, sweet and slightly sticky, washed off with warm wine and a second cloth. The room was quiet during this ritual. No one spoke. Only the fire and the soft sound of water moving in bowls. Skin like porcelain, the pale eidolon, the medieval imagination. Pale skin was not just beautiful, it was a sign of virtue, nobility, and inner purity. To be fair was to be free from labor. A tanned face suggested peasantry. A ruddy cheek, too much blood, too much lust, too much lust, too much flesh, so queens, whose lives were spent in shade and shadow, aimed always to maintain a pale, luminous look. Help with whitening agents, of course, some common and alarming formulas included: lead white, ground into powder and mixed with vinegar or egg whites, ground pearl. For those who could afford it, stirred into cream chalk dust. Lightly patted onto the skin rice powder, sometimes imported from the East lily root. Dried and ground for a more natural tone, the whitened face was not applied in thick masks, but rather in soft layers, dabbed on with a cloth, smoothed by, fingers then set with a final powdering. The effect: translucence, a glowing pallor, like marble come to life. But underneath, the skin could crack, peel, and sometimes scar. Lead, especially, had side effects. But queens bore it, because beauty was a burden worn for the realm. Brows and foreheads, the art of absence what? We now consider full brows would have scandalized a medieval court. The ideal brow was stin-arched, nearly invisible, to achieve this. Noble women plucked daily, or had it done for them. Sharp bone tools, tweezers of silver, or even beeswax strips were used to remove every hair. The forehead, too, was treated. A high domed forehead was the sign of intelligence and grace. To extend the forehead, many queens plucked their hairline. Some went as far as the crown of the head, creating a slope of skin above the brow. One account from the court of Burgundy describes a princess being plucked by 3 attendants, using goosebone razors and a lemon cloth to soothe the sting. It hurt, but beauty often did, and once bare, the brows could be penciled, just a fine line, drawn with lamp-black soot or charcoal, barely visible. Brows were not meant to be seen. They were meant to suggest silence, restraint, control, lips, cheeks, and the quiet color of life. A pale face was the canvas. But life still had to be suggested. Delicately royal women tinted their lips and cheeks with great care. Common pigments, red ochre, from earth, madder root, steeped in wine-crushed beetroot, mixed with honey alkanet, soaked in oil cochineal. For the wealthiest derived from dried insects, it yielded a rich crimson. But these colors were applied lightly. Too much red was vulgar, too much shine. Dangerous dot rouge was dabbed with fingers or a tiny cloth pad. Lips were brushed, then wiped. Gently. The goal was not glamour, but health, to appear fresh, modest, gently blooming. Some queens bit their lips softly before a council session to bring a natural flush. Others kept clove buds under their tongues to scent their breath and color. Their lips at once, beauty was subtle, controlled, felt more than seen. Let us pause now. The queen's face is ready. Her mirror lies beside her. Her eyes rest closed, just for a moment, before the veil is drawn and the day begins. Outside, bells ring, court is stirring. But inside, within the hush of lace and rosewater, the royal face has been born again. Crowned by hair tresses, tools, and the labors of royal adornment, asterisk, let down your hair, but carefully. The queen sits now in a low-backed chair. The morning light is brighter, glinting against a tray of combs. Her veil has been removed. Her hair long, weighty, brushed in slow rhythm spills across her shoulders like a tapestry unrolled. Hair was not only beauty, it was burden. And for a medieval queen, it was also a language one of virtue, lineage, devotion, and discipline. Tonight, or rather, this lingering morning, we brush not just through strands, but through centuries of meaning, through oils and pins, scissors and scent, through headpieces and headdresses, and the hands that worked in silence behind them. Let us begin, as always, with care. Hair as heritage to be noble was to have noble hair. Length signaled legacy. Shine reflected health. Thickness whispered fertility. Royal daughters were praised for their locks before they were praised for their learning. And among queens, hair was often compared to gold not only in color, but in value. It was rarely cut from girlhood. Hair was tended and trained. Some queens never cut it in their lives. Others only upon entering religious orders or widowhood. Poets wrote of hair like woven sunbeams, clouds at dusk, threads of moonlight, but behind the verse lay hours of brushing, of washing, of drying, of braiding, and of pain. The combs of Queen's A royal woman's grooming kit included more than one comb. She had a wide tooth comb, to untangle a fine tooth comb, to smooth a knit comb, narrow and close. For catching lice, a bone pick. For parting and lifting strands, a soft brush. If she was very fortunate made with boar bristle or horsehair, these combs were often carved from ivory or polished horn. Some bore inscriptions, prayers, poems, or the name of the queen herself. A few had gold leaf pressed into the engraving. They were kept wrapped in linen, often perfumed with cloves or lavender, and laid upon a wooden tray beside a mirror, and oils. Combing began gently, always in silence, from root to tip. Section by section. One attendant combed, another held the bowl of oil. A third offered cloths. It was a ceremony, a daily renewal, a moment of shared stillness between the queen and those who served her most closely, washing hair. A rare and ritual act. Hair washing was infrequent, not because of laziness, but because water was feared to unbalance the humors. Too much washing was said to cause headaches, chills, or even madness, and yet queens washed their hair when, before high feast days, before royal weddings, or births after long travel, during religious rites, or as part of a seasonal cleansing. Typical hair wash included rainwater, collected and filtered herbal infusions of rosemary, chamomile, or thyme lye soap in small amounts, or ash and egg yolk, a final rinse of vinegar or rose water. The queen would sit upon a low stool, her hair spread into a basin or draped across a wooden board. Attendants poured water from ewers, gently massaging her scalp. Afterward, her hair was dried with fine linen towels or by fanning. In warm seasons, she might sit by an open window. In winter, by the fire carefully, to avoid scorching. The whole process might take hours, and it was never rushed. Oils, powders, and scents to maintain hair between washes. Queens relied on a delicate regimen of ointments and dry perfumes. Oils were massaged into the scalp. Olive oil, for shine almond oil, for softness, castor oil, believed to encourage growth. Infused oils, scented with lavender, sage, or mint after oiling. A light powder was applied to the roots. Rice flour for smoothing crushed iris root. For scent ground myrtle leaves. For volume this absorbed excess oil and helped style the hair. In summer, extra powder was used to ward off lice. In winter, heavier oils sealed in moisture. Scent was paramount. The queen's hair was expected to smell sweet. Her pillows were sprinkled with dried herbs, and her headdress lined with scented wadding. No one should ever wrinkle their nose in her presence. Hairstyles, as hieroglyphs. The way a queen wore her hair told you everything about her. Some examples: loose hair, maidenhood or mourning; a young princess or a grieving widow; braided hair, respectable matron; often coiled, pinned or veiled; bound in a net; modesty, especially in court; plaits wrapped around the head; wealth, time, servants; veiled entirely; piety, chastity; or strategic withdrawal; half veiled with a circlet, ceremony, but not high court. Some queens wore their hair long and trailing behind them, especially in Eastern courts, like Byzantium or Heian Japan. Others kept it confined, sleek and structured. Hair could be adorned with ribbons, often red or gold pearls, sewn into braids, jewels, suspended from pins, tiny bells, for feasts or dances, gold thread, wrapped like silk flossage element. Added weight: a full court headdress might weigh several pounds, and yet the queen bore it, because beauty, once again, was performance, dyes, bleaching, and hair color ideals. The ideal hair color varied by region and era, but among many European courts, blonde or golden hair was highly prized, evocative of light, youth, and purity. Queens with dark hair might bleach it. Methods included soaking in alum water, followed by sun exposure, rinsing with lemon juice, washing in lye, then covering the hair with white clay, applying ash paste, a crude but effective method. These treatments were harsh. They dried the hair. Sometimes they caused burns, but the result, lightened strands, kissed by sun or artifice, was seen as desirable. In other courts, like in Moorish Spain, dark glossy hair was ideal, coated in walnut oil or henna for sheen. In Heian Japan, aristocratic women grew their hair to ankle length, dyed it with indigo, and perfumed it nightly with incense smoke. In all cases, color was not only admired, was curated. The veil and the crown, once the hair was set, it was often covered. Queens rarely showed their hair fully in public. Modesty and hierarchy demanded it. Layers included cap, linen, close to the scalp, coif structured support, tied beneath the chin, wimple wrapped around neck and head veil, draped from crown or circlet atop the veil. Securing all each layer had a name, a meaning, a price. Even in privacy, some queens veiled, and when they unveiled before their mirror, their ladies, or their husband, it was a moment of rare exposure, vulnerability, intimacy. Let us pause. The queen's hair has been dressed. Her oils have been applied, her braids wrapped and pinned. The final net has been fastened. Her circlet rests atop it all. She is ready, or rather her hair is ready. The woman beneath, still waiting. The performance of beauty, ceremony, judgment, and the quiet cost of the mirror. Asterisk, the chamber opens, the hour approaches. The queen rises. Her veil is drawn forward. Her face is powdered, her brows nearly gone, her lips a soft suggestion of rose. She is ready for court. But what does it mean to be beautiful in the medieval world? To have your worth weighed in pale cheeks and high foreheads? To live within a face not fully your own? This final section steps beyond the chamber and into the hall, the chapel, the wedding procession, the pageant, into the ceremonies and scrutiny that defined the royal woman's visible life. Where beauty was not comforted, was expectation. Let us walk beside her, step by step, and observe how the mirror extended beyond the glass, and into the world, courtly beauty as Judah too. Be royal was to be seen, and to be seen was to be judged. The medieval queen did not choose when to appear. Her schedule was marked by court events, feast days, processions, baptisms, weddings, and religious ceremonies. She was expected to embody grace and serenity always, and beauty was part of that. Performance, a queen's appearance could inspire, or it could secure alliances, it could stabilize shaky succession, it could quiet whispers or ignite scandal. Foreign ambassadors sent reports on the condition of her skin, on the texture of her hair, on whether her teeth were white, whether her hands were soft, whether she moved with fluidity or stiffness. One Venetian envoy, describing Queen Isabella of Spain, noted, "She is not of great height, but her posture gives the impression of command. Her face is clear, of modest complexion. Her eyes are large and quiet. Her hands are clean and ringed." He might as well have been describing a statue. Queens were statues, sometimes alive, but required to be still. Portraits and painted truths before mirrors could reflect clearly. Portraits offered a controlled reflection. Painted likenesses of queens were as much propaganda as representation. They softened wrinkles, elevated chins, painted hands smaller than they were, skirts wider, necks longer, and most of all, skin smoother, whiter, unchanging. Yet even in these illusions we see clues. The narrow set of the shoulders, the deliberate placement of the hands, the slight tension around the mouth, the downward tilt of the eyes were not expressions of identity. They were expressions of role in illuminated manuscripts. Queens were often shown praying or bestowing gifts, or watching their husbands always quiet, always composed. Their beauty was framed by what it promised: piety, fertility, diplomacy, rarely, pleasure, cosmetics, and faith. The delicate balance, religion, influenced every facet of royal life, including appearance. Cosmetics were tolerated, but frowned upon in excess. Church sermons warned against vanity. Paint was likened to deceit. There were accusations, particularly against queens from foreign lands, that makeup was the mark of temptation, and yet the same critics expected beauty. The contradiction was not lost on the queens. Some responded by using only natural pigments. Others applied makeup behind closed doors, never in public. Some queens consulted confessors before altering their appearance, seeking reassurance. In the Islamic courts of Al-Andalus, beauty was praised more openly. Poetry described eyes lined with kohl, lips stained with henna, and cheeks powdered with crushed pearls. Grooming was considered part of hygiene, and thus virtuous in Jewish households. Queens like Dona Gracia Mendez were admired for elaborate headdresses, perfumed garments, and intricate braided styles, an expression of dignity and divine celebration. Beauty was not a sin, but its display was a negotiation. Superstition, magic, and the hidden mirror. Many queens believed that beauty could be protected or stolen. Mirrors were sometimes feared. Some were covered at night, lest dreams escape into them. Others were blessed or anointed with oil. Tales abounded of mirrors that whispered secrets, that revealed aging before it appeared, that held glimpses of one's fate. Cosmetic formulas were guarded like spells. Recipes were written in code. Ingredients had dual purposes, both aesthetic and medicinal or spiritual. A common charm whispered during grooming, "Clear my face as water clears the moon." Perfumed oils might be mixed with small stones of carnelian or lapis, believed to ward off envy, and always a lock of hair was kept hidden, tucked in a locket, pressed in a book, burned in fire when love soured, because beauty was also vulnerability, and The mirror, it saw everything. The pageant and the parade when the Queen appeared in public. It was not a walk, it was a pageant. She was lifted onto a litter, shaded with a canopy. Or she rode side saddle, veiled, gloved, her dress lined. With bells or pearls or ermine. Crowds watched. And what did they see? A veil, thin enough to hint at a sculpted chin, a train, carried by 6 maidens, a headdress that rose like a crown of birds' hands that never reached for railings. A smile that never widened, the people whispered. Did she look tired? Was she with child? Was her hair darker than last year? A single glance could become legend, a rumor, a ballad dot. And so the Queen learned not only to look beautiful, but to be seen as beautiful, even when she was ill, even when she was grieving, even when she was exhausted from childbirth or terrified of war. The hidden cost, pain and maintenance beneath. The surface, beauty, required pain. Wigs itched, headdresses gave headaches. Lead powders scarred, plucking caused infections. Corsetry bruised the ribs, hairpins drew blood. Nail dyes stained the skin, and beyond the physical, silence. A queen could not complain of these pains. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge. Effort and beauty, by royal standard, must appear effortless. So she smiled. She blinked slowly. She folded her hands in her lap, and in the mirror she studied her reflection, not to admire it, but to check for cracks. In widowhood, an age what happened to the royal mirror when the Queen aged. It was softened, moved, darkened by time and disuse. Older queens often adopted a different kind of beauty, solemn, sacred, still. They dressed in dark colors, wore simpler veils, ceased painting their faces. Their hair, if it grayed, was covered entirely. But even then, they were expected to be composed. Dignified, handsome, serene, aged queens held power, sometimes more than before. They advised sons, oversaw granddaughters' marriages, founded churches, directed convents, but still they looked in the mirror, sometimes in memory, sometimes in curiosity, rarely in regret. One queen, now in her 60s, wrote in her journal, "The face has faded, but the eyes remain. They still know what was required." Before bed, the face unwinds at the end of the day. The queen's veil is removed. Her pins are taken out, her braids unwrapped, her lips wiped, her cheeks cleaned, her shoulders, finally, relaxed. She sits before the mirror, not to prepare, but to release. Her attendant removes the makeup gently. Oil on linen, warm water, soft touches. The Queen breathes slowly, her skin bare, flushed from the day, and for a moment, just a moment, she sees herself, not as queen, but as woman, not performing, not adorned, simply herself. Then the mirror is turned down, the candle snuffed, and the chamber sleeps. A final reflection in the end. The royal mirror did not only show a face, it reflected a world that demanded stillness from women who longed to speak, a world that measured worth in angles, color, and concealment, a world where beauty was not only a gift, it was a yoke, a ritual, a performance, but within it, royal women found grace. They carved space to rest, to laugh behind the veil, to hold mirrors for their daughters, and sometimes to look and see not duty, but dignity. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Story 2, Whispers in Silk. The lives of royal taster, servants and eavesdropping, eunuchs tasting for the throne, the hidden lives of the monarch's most trusted servants settle in. The candles are lit. ... The dining hall is quiet now. The table has been laid with silver. The goblets are polished. The bread is warm. In the corner, a slender servant waits not to eat, but to sample. His role is not to dine, but to survive what the king may not. Across the palace, behind tapestries, another figure kneels quietly by the wall, listening not to gossip, but to policy. His ears gather secrets like dust. These are not nobles, not knights, not poets. They are the unseen. This is their story. The royal taster, a life between bites before a king lifts his goblet or forks his meat. Another hand must do so first. The royal taster, known variously as the assayer, Dapifer, or Sahili, was one of the most discreet, most trusted servants in any medieval court. His job was simple in word, yet terrifying in practice. Taste every dish and sip every cup before it touched the royal lips. If it was safe, he lived. If not, he did not. And yet the position was highly coveted. Who were these tasters? Tasters were often young noblesmen from minor houses who sought favor. In other courts, they were slaves, eunuchs, or servants born into generations of kitchen labor. In Islamic caliphates, the saki or cupbearer often doubled as taster. In Byzantine courts, eunuchs filled this role due to their perceived loyalty. In English courts, the position was called the carver or the cupbearer, sometimes rotated to limit the risk of corruption. Their backgrounds varied, but their futures were tied to the king's digestion. The ritual of safety tasting was a choreographed act. Food arrived from the kitchen under guard. A servant inspected it for foreign objects. The taster sampled small bites from each dish. He sipped from the rim of every goblet. He waited several minutes. Sometimes he was watched, sometimes not. Some tasters wore rings with antidote, small, hollow compartments filled with thuriac or powdered bezoar. Others chewed garlic or parsley constantly, believed to neutralize poison, and yet poison was rare. The real danger: spoiled food, meat left too long, mushrooms misidentified, fermented wine turned sour. Tasters died not only of malice, but of error. Dying at the table, tasters occasionally succumbed. In 13th century Sicily, a taster named Lorenzo collapsed after sampling a pigeon pie. The pie had turned. The king survived in Mughal India. The emperor's cupbearer once died sipping from a goblet laced with powdered lighter. Political rivals ploy. The goblet was changed. The plot foiled. These deaths were quietly buried, often with small honors. Their families received gifts, but their names vanished, because to speak of them was to acknowledge vulnerability. When taste wasn't enough, not all poisons acted quickly, so kings relied on layers of protection, silver utensils, which supposedly darkened in the presence of arsenic, bezoars, goatstone relics believed to absorb poison, antidote wines laced with cinnamon, honey, and crushed coral, daily purges to flush any lingering toxins. The taster was the first defense, but never the only one, and in the candlelight of the dining chamber, he waited hand on goblet, lips to spoon, heartbeat steady, the eavesdropping eunuch, shadow of the court now. Step softly. We move to another room, quieter, dimmer, a hallway behind the queen's chamber, a passage behind the king's throne, a vent above the council. Here, another kind of servant waits. The eunuch castrated, silenced in body but sharpened in mind, listens. He gathers words not meant for him. Who were the eunuchs? Eunuchs were employed in many courts: Byzantine Empire, Abbasid, Caliphate, Imperial China, Ottoman Turkey, Ethiopian and Indian royal courts. They were trusted precisely because they were outside the bloodline. They could not father children, could not lead dynasties, could not seduce the queen or be seduced. This made them perfect for proximity, and in that proximity they heard everything. Listeners in silk eunuchs were given soft robes, often of fine silk. Their feet were trained to step silently. Their gaze never lingered. Their presence was like air dot, and yet they remembered everything. They served tea, poured wine, stood behind curtains during strategy councils, held the bowl of water during confessions, sat at the queen's bedside when no one else could. They were taught to observe, not speak, but they could speak when needed, and when they did, monarchs listened. The power of a whisper eunuch might inform the king of betrayal, might hint that a nobleman had left. In anger, might murmur that a concubine cried alone. Their knowledge was currency, their silence leverage. In some courts, eunuchs became chief ministers, diplomatic envoys, intelligence gatherers. They had no families, no distractions, only the court, only the crown, and the echoes they carried. Let us pause now. The meal has ended. The queen retires. The taster exhales. The eunuch extinguishes the candle, and in the darkness the palace rests. But even in rest, someone listens. Someone always tastes. Someone always remembers. Between power and silence, secrets, scandals, and the trusted tongues of the royal court, asterisk, the unseen, and the essential in the vast stone palaces of the medieval world. Power echoed not only in voices that roared but in those that never spoke. There were servants who knelt at the foot of the throne and never met the sovereign's gaze, and there were others, more silent still, who knew every secret, every sigh, every whispered conspiracy behind the curtain. They were not celebrated, they were not painted into murals, but they remembered everything. Tonight, we sit beside them again. The game of proximity power often begins with proximity, how close you can stand to the ruler, and how long you can remain unnoticed. The royal taster and the court eunuch existed at the inner edge of royal intimacy. They touched the monarch's food. They handled the royal robes. They passed secret letters, held doors open to forbidden meetings, and ushered in messengers at dawn. In doing so, they became repositories of knowledge. The taster might hear a whispered prayer before the king lifted his wine. The eunuch might glimpse that expression on the queen's face when she read a letter from home. They collected data no scribe could capture, and they kept it out of fear, out of duty, sometimes out of love. Secrets carried by hand in many royal courts, messages could not be trusted to couriers. Instead, human channels were used servants, so invisible. Their presence was never noticed, only assumed. Tasters were occasionally asked to deliver coded messages hidden in food dishes. A clove placed in a certain pattern, a pastry folded just so, a salted fig instead of a sugared one. Each tiny variation meant something. Eunuchs passed notes as well. They often tended to royal children. In the nursery, in the private corridors, they moved freely. A child might carry a letter stitched into a doll. A eunuch might retrieve it, read it aloud to a queen too afraid to touch the parchment. In court like the Abbasid Caliphate or Temps, China, eunuchs served as living mail systems, transporting secrets across vast palaces. They were never searched, they were never stopped, because who would suspect the silent one? The walls had ears and, Those ears had names. It is tempting to think of surveillance as modern dot, but in medieval palaces, eavesdropping was a skill trained, practiced, perfected. Some eunuchs were trained to recognize tone and cadence. They could tell when a noble was angry, even if he whispered. They noted footsteps, whose were light, whose were heavy, who lingered outside a door. They memorized phrases. A passing complaint, a joke told at someone's expense, a sigh between words. These fragments were reported upward carefully, not as accusations, but as observations, and in some cases they changed history. The Queen's confidants were often placed in the service of royal women, because they were not considered men by the standards of court morality. They were permitted to be present when no other male could go, during the Queen's bathing in her dressing room, at her bedside during illness in the birthing chamber, even in mourning. This proximity created bonds. A queen might tell her eunuch things she could not tell her husband. She might cry openly or rage privately. She might ask for stories from his homeland. She might whisper her fears in the dark, and the eunuch listened. Some kept these secrets until their death, others did not. The keeper of scandals, there were scandals, of course, a secret lover, a bastard child, a suspicious death. The eunuchs often knew first, and sometimes they were asked to handle it, to fetch a midwife in secret to dispose of letters, or jewelry, to arrange a sudden trip, to burn clothing stained with something that couldn't be explained. They did so with precision. No questions, no notes. In return, they were paid, promoted, protected. But some used this knowledge for gain. They became puppet masters, blackmailers, or simply survivors in a game they never chose to play. In the Ottoman court, one chief eunuch held enough power to influence sultanic succession. In China's Ming dynasty, the eunuch Wei Zhongxian essentially ran the state for a decade. Their silence gave way to speech, and their whispers became commands. Death by knowledge. Some tasters and eunuchs knew too much, and in knowing they became dangerous. There are stories of tasters who were poisoned after uncovering a plot, but before they could report it, there are eunuchs who disappeared after the Queen's death. No funeral, no record. One record from the court of Charles V of France notes, "The boy who bore the wine tray is gone. His cot lies empty. His name is not spoken." Why? Because sometimes the one who stands nearest the crown sees too much, and in seeing becomes disposable. The memory of the servant tasters and eunuchs were rarely given gravestones, but their knowledge lived in quiet customs, in revised menus, in altered building plans. One kitchen in Alhambra was redesigned after a taster noted that a certain window allowed food to be tampered with from outside. One corridor in Topkapi Palace was rebuilt because a eunuch overheard a plot to rooms away too thin. They were engineers of silence. Historians find them not in poetry, but in structural changes, in the width of a door, the curvature of a staircase, the depth of a wine. Jug, let us pause here. The taster's room is dark. His spoon is washed. The eunuch closes the diary he writes in only for himself. No one will read it, but the memory remains in silence, in stillness, in every forgotten echo of the royal court. The soft power of the invisible legacy, loyalty, and the lingering echoes of silence. Asterisk. They were never at the center, but always nearby. In every tapestry of royal life, there are figures just outside the frame. They do not wear crowns. They do not speak in council. They do not leave heirs or emblems or crests, but they shape history from the margins with ears, hands, and silence. This final section traces the long shadow cast by royal tasters and eunuchs not through titles, but through influence, through the decisions made because of a warning, a glance, a whisper, through the soft power of those who were never meant to lead, but often held the fate of nations in their quiet grasp, more than poison. The political role of the taster, though best known for preventing poisonings, the royal taster sometimes played a far more complex role in the machinery of the court. In many cultures, tasters were more than mere mouths. They were testers of loyalty. Their reactions were watched. Their demeanor was studied. They were trained to detect not only toxins, but subtle shifts in quality of wine to bitter, a sauce to sour, a texture to smooth dot. Why? Because sabotage wasn't always fatal. Sometimes it was symbolic. Serving a Hafritan fish on a feast day could shame a visiting envoy. A sour wine could humiliate a queen. The taster's job was to preempt disgrace as much as death. Over time, this developed into a kind of diplomacy. The taster might suggest menu changes, might intervene before a dish left the kitchen, might adjust a spice ratio based on a guest's region. They became, in essence, editors of the royal palatand, therefore, subtle sculptors of royal hospitality. Eunuchs as record keepers and archivists in many courts, eunuchs were entrusted with documentation. Their proximity to both domestic and political spaces made them ideal archivists. They copied diplomatic letters, maintained household ledgers, recorded daily routines of the monarch-managed birth and death registers, but they also kept unofficial records in the Abbasid court. Eunuchs recorded the emotions of the caliph, how he reacted to letters, to news, to weather. These emotional logs informed how and when to present petitions. In the Ming court, eunuchs tracked which concubines visited the emperor and when. Their metadata of intimacy shaped not only court gossip but succession itself, and in some cases, these quiet records became evidence against treason. For innocence, the eunuch scroll could exonerate or condemn, not because he was judge, but because he had been there. The tailors of royal perception beyond taste and knowledge. Tasters and eunuchs managed how the monarch was seen. A eunuch might subtly adjust the queen's veil before an audience. He might whisper that her eyes appeared tired, suggesting a touch of collyrium to brighten them. A taster might recommend switching a bitter stew for a gentler one if the king had been ill, might delay a dessert if the visiting noble was known. Too fast, these decisions, invisible though they were, shaped the perception of the royal household. A happy king, a graceful queen, a smoothly run court. The image was as important as the reality, and the servants who lived in silence were often its architect's legacy. Without lineage, most tasters and eunuchs left no descendants. They had no bloodlines, no houses, no heirs, but they often became mentors. An older eunuch might train the new one how to listen without looking, how to read lips without staring, how to avoid being noticed in a room full of men seeking notice. A senior taster might pass on the recipes for antidotes, the smell of spoiled almond paste, the way a poisoned goblet sometimes felt cold, unnaturally, to the touch. These oral legacies continued for generations, not in books, but in habits. Even today, in some ceremonial palaces, there are tasting rituals with no real danger but done anyway, echoes of fear and of devotion, friendship beneath the thrones sometimes. These roles became bonds. A eunuch might become the queen's confidant. A taster might become the king's unofficial food advisor, even jokingly called his second stomach. These relationships were not romantic, nor were they formal. They existed in the space between utility and affection. In one letter from a 15th century Burgundian duchess, she writes of her eunuch, "He is not of my blood, nor of my people, but he holds my moods like a bowl, and never lets them spill." These bonds were rarely written about, but they were felt, and when a taster died, sometimes a small mark was left in the court records, a line of poetry, a doubled ration for his son, a robe sent to his sister, because even the unseen, when loyal enough, were mourned. Reflections of the power they shaped. Power is rarely wielded by only one hand. It is held, carried, adjusted by many. And in the medieval court, the most silent servants often shaped the loudest outcomes. A letter undelivered, a name whispered at the right moment, a taste that changed a menu and a treaty, a suspicion confirmed by a look in the Queen's eyes, a distraction offered when anger rose, a meal delayed by a minute, just enough to avoid an ambush. These are not the deeds sung in epics, but they are the moments that turned empires, and those who shaped them did. So without applause, without monument, only memory. In closing, the lives that echo, the taster puts away his tray. The eunuch folds the last towel. The monarchs sleep, and still the palace hums. It hums with memory, with choices, with lives that touched power, but never claimed it. These were the whisperers, the watchers, the loyal and the forgotten. Their silence was never empty. It was full of meaning, of risk, of trust. And tonight, in remembering them, we honor not just their tasks, but their humanity. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Another quiet life awaits, just behind the curtain, just before the dawn. Story 3. The Crown's Shadows, Forgotten Royal Siblings, and the Quiet Lives They Lived. Asterisk Born to Wait, The Royal Spare, The Silent Sister, and the Life Lived in Limbo. Asterisk The Candle That Was Never Lit. Some names were never carved into marble. Some footsteps never echoed in the great hall. Some children of kings and queens, born beneath embroidered ceilings and swaddled in fur, never ruled, never married grandly, never made the history books in bold. They lived in chambers beside the heirs. They dined at second tables. They were dressed in fine silk, yes, but never leading colors, never scarlet, never crowned. They were the younger sons, the older daughters, the second sisters, the crippled brothers, the ones who could have, but did in single quotes. This is their story. Tonight, we drift beside them. We move through corridors quieter than court. We sit beside looms and books and gardens, and we listen not for thunder, but for the hush of almost, of might have been, the spare air in many royal houses. To be born second, especially if one was a boyment, a life of contingency. The firstborn son was lavished with tutors, armor fittings, language lessons, priestly blessings. The second, he was kept nearby, close, but not too close. He was often sent away to a monastery or to foster with a distant noble family. He was trained, but never with the same urgency. He was the king's insurance policy if his brother died, in battle or of fever, or fell from a horse. The second son would be called back-dusted, off like a forgotten heirloom. But until then, he waited. Edmund of the Iron Circlet, considered Prince Edmund, second son of a Plantagenet king. He was born in a cold chamber in the Tower of London. His cries quieter than his brother Edward's. He nursed from a different wet nurse, war. His brother's outgrown linen, and was sent at age 7 to live in an abbey. There he learned Latin, copied texts, walked slowly behind monks. He was not unhappy, he was simply spare. When Edward was crowned, Edmund stood beside him, holding the train of his robe. He wore a circlet of iron, not gold, in his head. It was meant as a joke, perhaps, but the chronicler noted his eyes were steady, he smiled not. He later became Earl of Lancaster, but never king. He married a minor noblewoman. He died before his brother. No rebellion, no glory, no scandal, only silence. The elder sister's quiet pride in other cases. The firstborn was a girl, and she too was passed over. No matter her wisdom, her dignity, her beauty, she was not the heir. She was expected to marry well or enter a convent, to step aside gracefully when a younger brother was born. One such woman was Isabel of France, elder sister to King Charles VI. She spoke 3 languages. She managed estates. She once negotiated the release of a prisoner without consulting her father's advisors. But when Charles was born, all focus shifted. She was 12, and she never protested. Instead, she learned herbs. She trained hawks. She embroidered tapestries with scenes of calm seas and sleeping lions. A monk once asked why she sewed so many beasts. She replied, because they are noble, and they wait. Waiting as a way of life for royal siblings, life became a cycle of preparation and pause. Their education was robust after all. They might be needed, but their duties were vague. A prince might be named bishop, despite never desiring the cloth. A princess might be betrothed to an aging noble to cement a fragile alliance. A third son might be shipped to fight in a crusade, his name forgotten if he died. Their letters often reflect restraint. I hope my brother finds health. If I may serve, I shall. I remain, as ever, obedient. Their names living footnotes in funeral records, in the margins of coronation scrolls. They lived near power, but not within it. Let us pause the candles in the second wing of the palace flicker low. A woman sits beside her harp. A man sharpens a hunting knife he may never use. Their names are not shouted, but they linger in amber, in dust, in the soft creases of memory. The other half of the palace, shadows of royalty in the Islamic courts. India and East Asia, the partitioned palace in Europe. The royal sibling might have faded into the monastery or manor, but in the Islamic and Eastern courts, the palace itself could stretch like a city. Within its domes and latticed walls, whole lives played out rich, fragrant, disciplined, and silent. Some sisters never crossed the palace threshold. Some brothers never touched a sword, though born to wield one. Some siblings were both visible and invisible, lavished with silks, yet denied voices. Tonight, we enter those inner courts. We pass the velvet curtain. We do not knock, we only listen. The forgotten sons of the caliphates of the Abbasids, Fatimids and Umayyads. Succession was not always by primogeniture. A caliph could choose among his sons. This gave rise to parades of possibility brothers, educated with equal intensity, equal promise, and equal fear. Each prince hoped to be chosen. Only one ever was. The others waited. In halls of carved marble, among gardens and tutors and guards who watched more closely than they smiled. Some were given governorships of distant provinces. Others were kept near, not out of affection, but surveillance. One such prince was Abd al-Rahman, brother to a caliph of Cordoba. He was gifted a palace on the outskirts, filled with books, fruit trees, and courtiers trained in etiquette. But the gates were never unlocked. Letters were censored. Guests were searched. He lived 24 years without leaving. When he died, his brother wept not for loss, but relief. His heart was gentle, wrote one attendant, but his name was too strong. The harem's other daughters, in many Islamic royal courts, the harem was not simply a collection of wives. It was a world-walled city of women, children, eunuchs, tutors, and physicians. Princesses were born here. They were educated in poetry, calligraphy, music, and etiquette. But unlike their brothers, they were not sent out. They stayed, and so many lived and died within the palace. Their roles: mediators during family feuds, guardians of younger siblings, healers of the sick, keepers of ritual yet. Their names seldom crossed the palace walls. Some became powerful, quietly. In the Ottoman court, Miriam Sultan, daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, used her influence to fund schools, mosques, and public fountains. But her sisters, their names are known only through architectural donations and marriage. Contracts and many others are not known at all. The sister who heard too much one tale tells of a princess in the court of the Delhi Sultanate. She was unnamed called, only the pearl behind the screen in later chronicles. She was the elder sister of the reigning sultan, brilliant in arithmetic, fluent in Persian, devout in her prayers, and was curious. She kept a journal. In it, she recorded what she overheard between the viziers. She copied down speeches, intentions, troop movements. One day, the journal disappeared. So did she. No record of a death. No record of a marriage. Only an abrupt end to the writing. And one guard's testimony: she knew what others dared not. The Rajkumars, who never ruled in the princely states of medieval India. Royal families were vast. A Maharaja might have 10 or 20 sons by different wives, different castes, different alliances. Only one would inherit. The rest became Rajkumar's princes. Yes, but of nowhere. They were trained in swordsmanship, courtly speech, and Sanskrit philosophy. They wore silk, hosted feasts, rode elephants, but they had no titles. Some turned to religion-building temples or joining spiritual orders. Others became patrons of the arts, sponsoring plays or manuscripts. One such man was Rajkumar Deva. Third son of a Rajput ruler, he built a garden that bloomed only at night moon flowers, lilies, jasmine. He hosted musicians at twilight. He was known to sit for hours beneath a tree, reciting verses into the dark. He never married, he never ruled, and yet his garden outlasted the dynasty. The mirror rooms of the unseen in Rajasthan and Kashmir. Certain palace chambers were lined with mirror-steiny shards set into plaster, reflecting candlelight like stars. These were zenana, rooms reserved for royal women, and among those women were sisters of kings, never seen by subjects, never drawn by artists. They practiced mirror languages, gestures reflected back and forth, stories told without words, memories shared between glances. They watched the world from behind lattice, and the world forgot they were there. The emperor's brothers in imperial China in the Forbidden City, brothers of the emperor, walked a knife's edge, too ambitious. They were executed, too aloof. They were deemed disloyal. Many were sent to provincial posts, decorated with titles that meant little duke of everlasting obedience, prince of the third gate. They lived in luxury, but under surveillance. One such prince, brother of an early Ming emperor, spent 40. Years in a mansion with 168 rooms. He used only 3. He painted water scenes. He taught orphans to write. He sent poems to eunuchs in exchange for gossip. When he died, his tomb was modest, but on its wall a painting remained, a single boat drifting alone on a moonlit lake. No inscription, only silence. The letters they left most royal siblings are remembered not through monuments, but through letters, those they sent, those written about them. A few lines from a Safavid prince to his younger sister. My world narrows without your song in the garden. A scribbled note from a Tang princess. I heard the new lute boy sings off-key. Correct him for me. A journal entry from a Moroccan nobleman. I am the 4th of 9. I love no less. These traces, delicate and nearly erased by time, remind us they lived, they dreamed, they waited. Let us rest here. The courtyard is dark now. A silk fan sways in the still air. The night birds stir in jasmine trees, and in the shadow of crowns, stories whisper, too soft for history, but not for memory. Between obscurity and duty, the legacy of the royal shadow across continents asterisk, far from the throne. Close to the soul we have walked stone corridors and wandered mirror halls. We have heard the sighs of princes in embroidered cuffs and princesses, behind latticed veils, but now our footsteps turn toward less charted courts toward island kingdoms, earth-toned palaces, and riverine strongholds where royal siblings were not just quiet, they were memory peace holders and makers of dusklit history. They may not be listed in gilded archives, but they are felt in the stories passed down, voice to voice. Across centuries, let us walk slowly now. The ground is softer here. In the kingdoms of the Sahelin medieval West Africa, among the Sahelian kingdoms of Mali, Gao, and Songhai royal succession was often maternal. Kings came from the sisters of kings. Lineage ran through the mother's blood, and so royal aunties and uncles, cousins and siblings held quiet power behind the council drums. One such figure was Megan Connie, brother of Mansa Musa, though Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca would become legend. It was Connie who managed the kingdom in his absence. He did not hold the title, but he kept the granaries full. He ensured gold weights were honest. He opened the gate to the salt caravans and closed the gate to envy. He wrote no laws, but preserved the rhythm of daily rule. When Musa returned, he found a kingdom at peace, and Connie returned to silence. The sister by the shore in the coastal courts of Benin, women played subtle but profound roles in succession and courtly calm. Sisters of the Orba were often gifted oceanfront houses, sacred spaces where they conducted rituals and served as oracles in times of dispute. One such woman was a Gilai, elder sister to a 15th century Orba. She was known not for her voice, but for her silence. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her word held weight. It was said her presence could halt a feud. Her gaze could cool a room of hot tempers. When she died, her house was left untouched for 30 years. The waves, it is said, sounded different beside it. The chiefs who waited in the Pacific Islands. Chiefly siblings often lived in parallel respect. Even if not crowned in Hawaiian and Tongan society, younger brothers and sisters of Alia. High chiefs were considered part of the sacred household, but with different roles. A younger brother might serve as the speaker during council, so the chief's voice remained rare. The navigator during voyages, the warrior who fought so the chief could rule in peace. One such brother, Nawa of Hilo, guided his older brother's canoes for 20 years through storm and war and ritual return. He never claimed a title, but the star maps he drew were kept in hushed reverence for 3 generations. The peaceful brother of the Andean, the Incan Empire. Royal bloodline was complex, interwoven with sun myth, divine descent, and strategic marriages, while the Inca ruled as sun incarnate. His brothers and sisters formed the Panocotha royal lineage house. They performed rituals, advised in omens, and tended ancestral shrines. One such brother, Apusqui, lived in a stone house on the edge of Cusco. He never spoke in public, but he tended to the dead. He was keeper of the mummies, ensuring their clothes were clean, their offerings fresh, their names spoken. When children died, it was he who received them. He placed corn dolls in their hands. He whispered blessings in Quechua to the wind, to the empire. He was minor to the afterlife. He was the door. The siblings of story, not steel many royal siblings, found purpose not in court or council, but in the arts. A Mongol princess, denied power, commissioned tents woven with the names of every woman in her yacht. A Swahili prince wrote poetry in coral. Inca's verses later etched into the plaster of his sister's tomb. An ancestral Puebloan boy, born to a chieftain, never led but passed down every winter story to his nieces. Their power was never public, but their legacy was whispered, sung, woven, and remembered. The candle that didn't burn out there. There's a quiet strength in not ruling, in supporting without seeking, in preserving without proclaiming, across continents and centuries. Royal siblings remind us that history is not only made by crowns and conquests, it is also made by the hand that steadies the robe, the whisper that calms the fear, the footstep that turns away from envy, the gaze that chooses peace over prominence. They are the shadows that shaped the light, not by standing in front of it, but by making room for it. One final look back as we close this quiet story. Imagine a long hall in a quiet palace. Portraits of kings and queens line the walls, and beside them, no images, just a name or a gesture or a memory. The sister who soothed a mad ruler, the brother who declined a crown, the daughter who gave up marriage to care for her mother. They are not forgotten, not tonight. Tonight they are with us in the stillness, in the hush, in the shadow that is not dark but soft. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Another forgotten life flickers just beyond the next curtain. Story 4. The royal pantry, what kings ate, what servants stole, and what nobody touched. Asterisk bread, bones and beasts, a day inside the medieval royal kitchen. Asterisk before the bread rises, the kitchen begins before the sun does. There is no clock, only the memory of yesterday's ash, and the chill of a stone hearth waiting to be stirred back to life. The scullions rise first, their hands still sore from scrubbing trenches the night before. Then the bakers, then the meat boy, then the pot boy, then the steward, and somewhere, far above them, the king still sleeps beneath 4 layers of linen and wool. This story is not his, it is the story of his food, how it's made, how it's handled, what gets touched, what gets tasted, and what goes. Strangely cold. Let's step quietly through the side door. Don't disturb the broth. The kitchen itself, a place of fire and ranktha. Royal kitchen is not a single room. It is a series of connected Hellslow ceilings, soot-stained beams, stone floors slick with fat and damp flour. There is a boiling room, where enormous cauldrons bubble from morning till night. There is a roasting hearth, where iron spits groan under the weight of entire animals, boar, deer, lamb, and peacock. There are separate rooms for pastry, vegetables, bread, and confectionery, the last of which is locked, always. For reasons we will come to, the air is hot even in winter. The cooks wear only loose linen, and sweat like horses. There are flies, there is shouting, there is always a chicken feather where it should not be, spices under lock, and spooning a world of salted meat and boiled barley. Flavor was gold, and real gold was easier to come by than pepper. The royal kitchen's spice room was under key, managed by a spicer, a man who handled nothing else. He measured cloves from Zanzibar, saffron from Andalusia, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, peppercorns from Karaluth. These spices were weighed with tiny brass scales, portioned into ceramic thimbles, and dispensed in trembling teaspoons. The spicer did not trust the cook did not trust the potboy, and the potboy sometimes licked his fingers when no one looked, which someone always did. Bread for the high table bread was not mere bread. It was a social signaler, geography of flour. The finest white loaf, made from sifted wheat, was for the king and queen. Coarser loaves, half barley, were for nobles and favored guests. Black loaves, dense and bitter, were for servants and guards. And then there were trenchers flat, dry rounds of bread used as plates. These were not eaten by the royals. After the meal they were given to the poor, unless the poor never received them. Sometimes they were eaten by kitchen boys, stolen from scraps. Sometimes they were burned to ash in the hearth, tossed before ever reaching a mouth. One record from an English royal kitchen shows a note: 8 trenchers, unaccounted for, steward docked 3 pence, boy beaten, bread not missed. Soup that boils all day soup was the constant dot. Each pot began at donge bones, root vegetables, herbs, water, and boiled until dusk. Meat changed with the hour. Bread came and went, but the pot never stopped. Everyone dipped from it, the steward, to check salt, the cook, to soften his voice, even the guards, in secret. Before their shift, there were tales of rings lost in that pot, of fingers dipped and never found, of a tooth that cracked on a pebble, and of a soup so fine it made a baron weep. But no one remembered the recipe. Only the ladle, warped from use, remembered. Food for ceremony, peacock, swan, and mystery wen. The king feasted. It was a spectacle, and so the kitchen created food not meant to be eaten, or at least not meant to be enjoyed. Peacocks were roasted and redressed in their own feathers, necks arched, eyes beaded with wine-soaked raisins. Swans were skinned and sewn again, their flesh laced with cloves and ginger. A pie might contain a live bird, fluttering out when cut. The taste, often poor, overcooked, rubbery, but the goal was not nourishment. It was wonder. Sometimes these dishes were returned untouched. Sometimes they were sampled, then discarded, and sometimes they were stolen. The kitchen boys knew which birds were never watched. What the servants took theft was constant, not grand theft, no crown, jewels, just crumbs, slices of fruit, the last of the marzipan, the thick skin from the stew pot. One cook smuggled cheese in his boot. Another slipped tarts between layers of cabbage, pretending they were gifts for the compost heap. The punishments were uneven. A meat boy might be whipped. A senior cook might simply be reassigned. And sometimes no one noticed at all. The pantry, like the palace, had blind spots, and in those dark corners hunger lived. what nobody touched. Some dishes were sacred, or dangerous, or simply strange. They sat untouched. A cold eel, wrapped in gold leaf, a fig stuffed with crushed pearl, a meat pudding, made to resemble a child's face, served to impress a visiting ambassador, who instead turned pale and refused to speak. These dishes were returned, sometimes scraped by the dog dots, sometimes buried, sometimes eaten in silence by a taster too afraid to waste them. Their recipes faded, their memory lingered like a perfume in an empty hall. Let us rest now. The fires have dimmed, the breadcloths are folded, the murmur in their sleep. Above, the king dreams of battles. Below, the kitchen dreams of breakfast. The ritual of serving banquets, hierarchies, and the theatre of the royal table, asterisk, from kitchen to hollet, takes nearly 2 hours to move a meal from the boiling room to the royal table, not because of distance, but because of ritual. Each dish is examined, tasted by the taster, checked by the steward, sniffed by the marshal, sometimes blessed, and always documented before it even enters the great hall. And once it does, it is not merely eaten, it is performed to dine with royalty. Is not to eat, it is to witness a theatre of rank, etiquette, pageantry, and, occasionally, quiet defiance. Let's step softly into the hall. The candles are lit, the salt is placed, the show is about to begin. Setting the stage, the royal table, the royal dining table, was not always a permanent fixture. Often it was a folded trestle, assembled for each meal and then taken down. Upon it, a fine linen cloth, embroidered at the edge with symbols of the crown. Pewter or silver trencher's plates, depending on the guest's rank. Spoons, but rarely forks, those were foreign and suspicious. Goblets for wine, cups for ale, small glazed dishes for dipping salt. The king sat elevated. Sometimes on a platform he did not sit first. He arrived, and when he sat, all others stood, until he raised his goblet, then dash, and only then could they begin. Salt and status salt was not merely a seasoning, it was a symbol of hierarchy. The large ceremonial salt cellar, often shaped like a tower or ship, was placed in the center of the table. Those who sat above the salt between the king and the salt were favored. Those below the salt were lesser. No one questioned this. No one moved the salt, even when it meant sitting beside someone despised, even when it meant watching another eat the best cuts of meat, while you were served broth. The salt stood still, like power, like memory, who got what and when food did, not arrive all at once. It was served in courses, sometimes as many as 12. Each course might include a roast, a pie, a soup or stew, a boiled vegetable, a sweet of some kind, often early in the meal, a subtlety, a decorative, often inedible. Dish to delight the eyes, but not everyone received everything. Servants knew the first cut of meat went to the highest ranked. The crispest crust was saved for the king's plate. The sweetmeats were counted before and after. Wine was poured in tiers, red first, then white, then spiced. One guest might receive a gilded quail, another might get a goose leg, dry and overdone, and some guests, depending on favor, might get nothing more than bread. The dance of the servers serving was a choreographed ballet. Footmen moved in lines, trays high, eyes down. The carver approached with practiced elegant scutting, meat without tearing it, arranging it on the plate like sculpture. The cupbearer stepped forward when beckoned not before. A single misstep, a clatter, a spill and a career could be over. One French record from 1374 notes, The boy who dropped the apple tart has been dismissed. His replacement walks like a whisper. Wine, water, and watchfulness. Wine was served, diluted often with spice of cinnamon, clove, ginger. The royal cupbearer was responsible not only for pouring, but for ensuring the drink was safe. He tasted it first. He wiped the rim. He watched for reaction. If the king frowned, he stepped back and replaced the goblet without a word. In some courts, a silver straw was used. In others, the king drank from a communal bowl with his queen, an heir symbol of shared fate. But even this bowl had its rituals. The eldest dipped first, then the next. The last sips, often lukewarm and cloudy, were taken by the steward, a sign of loyalty or penance. The silence around food court meals were not loud. Conversation was permitted but controlled. Laughter was allowed but watched. Words, spoken too loudly, could be interpreted as mockery or rebellion, so the meals moved in a kind of quiet flow. The soft scrape of knife on trencher, the hushed pour of wine, the murmur of gratitude, the clink of a ring against goblet only, once the king signaled the end of the meal by standing, or placing his napkin down did noise return. Sometimes the dishes that danced some foods were meant for entertainment, not nourishment. Dishes included meat sculptures shaped like castles or animals, live birds baked into pies, released at the king's signal, sugarwork towers, spun into impossible heights, transparent jellies with flowers suspended in. Guest might receive a roast piglet with a gilded apple. A tart might arrive that wept, rosewater when cut. But there was a rule: never finish the performance dish. To eat it entirely was greedy. It was to consume beauty. So these were picked at, admired, and left behind until nightfall. When the servants returned, the leftovers, the dogs, and the quiet hands, after the feast ended, there was food left. Always, sometimes enough to feed 50 men, but it was not immediately given away. First, the king's dog was allowed to eat, then the trusted servants, then, perhaps, the porif, a clerk approved. But many dishes disappeared first. A tart pocketed, a wing of swan, snatched and hidden in a napkin, a bowl of almond milk, poured into a shoe for later sipping. The royal pantry fed many mouths, some known, some never. Spoken of, let us pause now. The table is cleared. The candles drip wax onto polished oak. The servers rest their trays. The king has gone to his chamber, and somewhere, deep in the pantry, the potboy licks the last of the quints from his thumb. Hunger, hoarding, and the politics of leftovers asterisk. After the last goblet, the candles are guttering. The royal belly is full. The guests have retired, some happily, others in bruised silence. The dogs have dozed beneath the table, still licking. The wooden floor, but the food remains. Roasted birds with half their skin, pie crusts emptied of filling, bowls of almond cream now soured at the edges. And so begins a second shifter, quieter ritual, away from the golden plates and the laughter. Of nobles. This is the hour of leftovers, and in the leftovers we find power, survival, and secret, the gate of Almanazat, the far side of the palace, near the service wing. There is a small gate. Each evening after the feast has ended and the food has cooled, this gate opens. The almoner, a cleric assigned to charity, appears with a wooden tally board and a soft-voiced assistant. Together, they inspect what remains. Trenchers soaked with fat, acceptable, bones picked clean, discarded, a half pie untouched by noble knife, claimed, These are given to the poor, waiting beyond the gateofin in silence, sometimes with song, but not everything reaches them. Not every crust is shared. Spoilage and the shadow of waste royal pantries, for all their abundance, lived under the constant threat of spoilage. There were no refrigerators, only cellars, cool basements, and clay pots sunk into wet soil. Cooks had tricks: boil meat in vinegar to extend its life, coat cheese in ash, submerge eggs in lime water, layer fruit in honey, but still much food spoiled, and spoiled food was dangerous, not just to the stomach but to the reputation of the court. A nobleman served rancid mutton might take offense. A visiting queen given sour milk might read it as insult. So the pantler keeper of the bread and dry goods kept strict ledgers. He recorded 3 apples spotted, discarded, stew congealed left for hounds. 1 jug turned wine replaced, steward informed. Behind the feast was a constant hum of decay, and behind that hum, men trying to stop it. The dogs of the pantry, not all leftovers were wasted. Some were set aside intentionally. For the royal dogs, these were not street curs. They were prized animals: greyhounds, spaniels, mastiffs scholared in brass and trained to silence. Their meals were prepared with care, bones removed, meat shredded, gravy added, sometimes thickened with bread. Each dog had a designated bowl. Each bowl was labeled in script. There are records of a dog refusing mutton 3 days in a rope, prompting concern. Another who licked his bowl to long, raising suspicion of a servant's theft. One mastiff who would only eat if the queen's maidservant fed him. These dogs lived well sometimes, better than the undercooks. The servants' share, while official rules dictated that food went to the poor or the hounds. In truth, much stayed within the palace walls. Cooks scraped the last of the custard into small wooden pots. Footmen folded bits of lamb into cloth and tucked them into sleeves. Wet nurses snuck roast pears back to their quarters. This wasn't greed, it was survival. Servants were often paid little or not at all. Their reward was proximity to power, yes, but also to food. And over time, networks emerged. A slice of pheasant meant a favor owed. A spoon of jam meant a secret kept in the shadow of the banquet. A different kind of economy bloomed. The storerooms of the privileged feunat. All leftovers were distributed or stolen. Some were set aside for future use in secure rooms. Behind thick doors, these were the cold pantries, the salt closets, the spice nooks. Access was restricted. Keys were few. In one English court, the mistress of the robes held a key to a locked jelly room, where spiced wine jelly was stored in delicate ceramic cups. In an Ottoman harem, the chief eunuch maintained a locked syrup room for fig paste, quince syrup, and rosewater confections. Not all these were used. Some were forgotten, found years later, hardened, crystalline, too beautiful to throw away, too old to eat. Hoarding as politics in some courts. Hoarding food was a form of protest. When a chamberlain was passed over for promotion, he quietly stopped forwarding certain preserves to the high table. When a steward felt slighted, he gave a lesser cut of meat to a favored guest and reserved the finest for himself. This was not rebellion, it was symbolic recalibration. A way to say, you may rule, but I hold the spoon. In one Italian court, the cook was discovered hoarding sugar loaves meant for the queen's confections. Rather than punish him, the king laughed and said, let him sweeten his bitterness. And so he did. For 3 more years, records that reveal and conceal royal pantries kept ledgers. Every loaf, every goblet, every joint of meat recorded with date, purpose, and recipient. But these records were curated. They did not show the scullion's pocketed plum, the nursemaid's filched custard, the steward's secret flask of elderberry cordial still. Patterns emerge. When you read enough entries like duck, uneaten, passed to dogs, or wine jug, broken contents, spilled, you begin to see the unwritten stories of hungers not named, of appetites just outside the light. What was never meant to be shared, and then there were foods that were not given, stolen, or stored. They were destroyed on purpose because they were sacred. They were dangerous. They had been touched by someone of low status, or no one trusted them. In France, it was common to burn the king's crusts. In Byzantium, wine that had sat more than 1 hour in the royal cup was poured over the garden. Soil. In the kingdom of Hungary, the last spoonful of broth was buried lest it be used in witchcraft. No one wept for these scraps. They were sacrificed to fear, to tradition, to silence. The last tastsome nights, when the palace was quiet and the feast forgotten, a servant would creep back into the hall. He would kneel by the table. He would take a crumb or a lick of honey from a goblet's rim, not out of hunger, but out of longing, to feel part of something greater, to share, even for a breath, the food of kings. Let us rest now. The fires are cold. The scraps are cleared. The ledgers are closed. And deep in the pantry, where no crown reaches, the shadows of appetite still linger. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Another quiet soul, behind another curtain, waits to be remembered. Story 5. The Royal Clock. How Kings Measured Time Before Timepieces, *, the sun's shadow. The candles drip, and the pulse of a palace day, *, before time, had hands. There is no ticking, no pendulum, no numbered face in the king's chamber, and yet he knows it is morning, not from a clock, but from the hush before the birds begin to sing, from the slight warmth under the shutter, from the quiet footsteps of a servant lighting the day's first taper. This was how royalty measured time before. Time itself was measured, not in seconds or minutes, but in sounds, shadows, scents, and rituals. Time was not a machine. It was a feeling. Let us walk slowly through a palace day, step by measured step, breath by measured breath. Dawn, the cold beneath the door. The first signal was not the sun, it was the chill before the hearth was lit, before the curtains opened. A draught swept beneath the door a cold ribbon across the stone floor. A servant, trained for silence, entered with an oiled wick. One candle was lit, then another. Each candle a promise. The day had begun. Then came the first sound, linen, stirring. Not voices, just fabric. The queen shifting beneath embroidered covers. The prince murmuring in sleep. The chamberlain stretching one stiff leg. Never both, so as not to creak. Time passed in warm breath and fluttered eyelashes. Not one word had been spoken, and still. The palace was already in motion. The first measure, the shadow on the tiles in royal gardens, stone tiles bore faint. Circular carvings, sun caught them at different angles, depending on the hour. By watching the shadow cast by a bronze finial or the curve of a statue's elbow, servants marked time. This was the king's first clock. When the light touched the lion's paw, time to rise. When it reached the rose trellis gate, time to eat. When it slid behind the fig tree, time to rest. Nothing ticked, nothing buzzed, but every royal knew. The rhythm of the sun's touch, The candle and its secret scandals weren't just for light, they were timekeepers. Each one, made from beeswax or tallow, was measured and marked. A 12-inch taper might burn for 4 hours. Servants scratched faint notches into the wax. 1 notch, first reading hour. 2nd notch, time for washing. 3rd, prepare the chamber for audience. Some noble. Households use candle clocks door, narrow columns with embedded metal balls. As the wax melted, balls dropped into a basin with a chime. The soft clink was both a signal and a lullaby. In the king's chamber. No bell rang, only the whisper of a falling pearl of brass. The bell towers, song monasteries and court chapels, marked time by bells, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Each rung bell framed the day with prayer and pause. Even secular royalty followed these rhythms. Prime, wash hands, receive breakfast, open petitions. Sext, cease audience, retreat to midday rest. Vespers, walk the garden, dine, and prepare for bed. In England, the watchman's bell told of the closing gate. In Al-Andalus, the call to prayer echoed through the courtyards, where Muslim servants gently guided Christian lords into silence. Time was marked not by control, but by listening, and in the quiet between the bells. Royalty often felt most free. Meals, as time markers breakfast, was not guaranteed, but dinner the midday meal and supper the evening meal were fixed points. In a floating day, they were not about hunger, they were about order. Food signaled change. A slice of bread meant the end of correspondence. A goblet of wine signaled the turning of the royal mood. A roasted bird marked the last official gathering before dusk. Even what was eaten told time's tale. Cold meats, morning, stews, midday, sweets, twilight. Time could be tasted, and time, once eaten, was gone. Reading by sun, not schedule royal scholars and tutors scheduled lessons not by hour, but by light. Each pupil's desk was positioned to catch maximum sunlight for a certain number of pages. A scribe might say, let him copy until the line touches the rim of the basin. When the sun moved on, the lesson ended at night. Only the most favored lessons continued by candlelight, with oil too precious to waste. Words, like ours, were rationed. The gardens clocksome royal households planted gardens that acted as natural clocks. Morning glories opened with dawn. 4 o'clocks bloomed toward dusk. Evening primrose marked the Queen's walk. When jasmine bloomed, it was time for music. When the lilies closed, the lutes fell silent. A gardener might be asked, not the time, but how far has the rose turned? And he would answer, half. A petal past noon. The scented hoursome queens marked time by scent. Perfumes were reapplied at intervals. Rose oil after prayer. Clove bomb before letters. Orange blossom before guests. A perfumed servant, called a fragrance keeper, managed. These transitions, not for indulgence, but for ritual. The Queen might not know the hour, but she knew when it was time for Neroli. The hush of night at dusk, the palace shifted. Windows were shuttered, candles snuffed, incense lit. A servant walked the halls with a sleep bell, its soft chime a signal to close the day. The king's chamber was cooled. The sheets turned. A bowl of lavender water sat at the bedside. There was no alarm, no countdown, only stillness, and sometimes, if the sky was clear, a glance at the moon. Waning, the month would end soon. Full, tomorrow would bring letters. A prince once said, "I never feared the dark, only the end of the wax." Let us pause here. The candle has burned to the second notch. The garden is still, the bell is quiet, and time has passed without a sound. The timekeepers themselves, people, roles, and the rituals that moved the day asterisk time, moved by hands in a royal household without mechanical clocks. People were the clocks. It was not just the sun, the candle, the bell. It was the boy who stirred the coals at dawn, the maid who drew the curtain before sunset, the steward who appeared exactly after prayers with the king's spiced milk. Each role carried not just a task, but a time in their movements. The day took shape in their silence. The night was kept still. Let's walk through the palace not following time, but those who carried it. The page and the pace royal page was trained not to serve, but to mark. He was taught how long it took to walk from the queen's chamber to the chapel, how many paces from the dining hall to the garden, the precise moment to tap the chamberlain's shoulder when the sun reached the threshold of the east wing. He kept no watch, but he knew that 3 deep breaths marked the distance between a door and a dais. A page was never early, never late, only present. The bell-ringer of Bretha, bell-ringer, lived in a small chamber above the chapel. He slept in shifts, one ear tuned to the sky's brightness, the other to the echo of footsteps in the corridor below. He rang matins just before dawn, lords as light broke, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, each a layer of time upon time. He rang softly when the queen was ill. He rang louder during feast days. Once, during a storm, the bell cracked. He wept not for the metal, but because time had lost its voice. The mistress of Sentin, the queen's wing, a woman held the hour in glass bottles. She knew how long a drop of amber oil lingered. She timed letters by the release of rose water on silk. She scheduled visits based on how quickly frankincense burned. The queen never asked for the hour. She simply reached for Nerli, and the mistress of scent prepared the room for evening. The chronicler's scrolly royal scribe recorded everything, not just events, but when they happened. The king dined as the jasmine wilted. The prince coughed during the 3rd bell. The comet appeared between the 2nd and 3rd candle mark of the night. These scrolls were not timekeeping for clocks. They were timekeeping for memory. To preserve, not precision, but meaning. The lullaby keeper in nurseries, nursemaids and nannies kept time through songs. Each song timed a task. 1 verse to wash, the face 2 to comb the hair, 3 to close. The shutter's children learned rhythm before they knew words. In some courts, lullabies were so precisely timed that queens asked for them to mark their own rest. A lullaby sung in the hall below was permission to close her eyes. Time was not always loud. Sometimes it came on a whisper. The steward and the spooned the palace. Steward governed meals, but he also set the tone of the day. He entered the kitchen at first smoke. He announced the king's hunger with a nod not too sharp. Lest it signal urgency, he measured courses by mood, not hour. If the king lingered too long over wine, the steward brought a bitter pear sign of closure. If guests talked too long, he removed the bread without asking. His spoon was a clock, and with it he shaped time. The monk of the minute in courts, influenced by religious orders, a monk or chaplain served as the timekeeper of the soul. He tracked sunrise masses, fasting windows, hours of confession, blessing candles by moon cycle. He knew that a certain silence in the chapel meant vespers had ended. He timed penance with a string of beads, and if the king died, he turned the hourglass 3 times, then rang a slow bell once every breath. Time, in his hands, became a prayer. The seamstress's shadows, the royal seamstress, marked time in stitches, a hem completed before noon, a tear repaired before Moonrise. She knew that the day's sewing must end when the light left the sill. In some courts, garments themselves bore time. Winter cloaks, lined with constellations. Tunics dyed to match dawn. Gowns embroidered only when the moon was full. The needle never rushed. Each pull was a pause, each knot a passing, the candle watcher knot. All candles burned the same. Some sputtered too fast, others dripped too slow, so the candle watcher often, a low-ranking page, monitored them with care. He learned when to trim the wick, when to shield the flame from draught, how to read wax tears as signs of ill luck. He knew that a steady flame meant the hour was true, and if the flame died before its mark, he relit it and said nothing, because time, even faltered, must continue. The keeper of forgotten hours, and then, in every court, there was someone no title, no scroll, who simply remembered. When the old king last smiled, how long the queen grieved. The rhythm of a song once played in the garden. This person might be a cook, a laundress, a falconer, but they carried the palace's quiet calendar, not of seasons, but of moments. They might say, she always walked then, when the mint began to bloom, and others would nod. Time, unspoken, passed through them. Let us rest here. The page has paused at the door. The bell ringer sleeps. The steward folds his cloth, and the queen listening. To the last line of a lullaby knows, the day is done. Time without clocks, festivals, seasons, and the eternal royal calendar, asterisk, the long time in royal courts. Time was not only counted by candles or measured by bell. There was another kind of time. The long time, it was not hour to hour, but moon to moon, feast to feast, bloom to fall, birth to death. Kings and queens, for all their gold and scribes, lived not by the ticking of hands, but by the quiet turn of seasons and symbols. Their calendars were not printed, they were embroidered, carved in stone, sung in processions, and whispered in gardens. Let us now step through the long year as it once unfolded, slowly in silk and shadow, winter's deep, time of fire and memory when the frost came. Time slowed, the palace grew quiet, the days shortened, and the hallways filled with candlelight and low voices. In this season, royalty remembered anniversaries, of births, of deaths, of long-forgotten treaties. The feast of St. Nicholas brought gifts. Yule brought evergreen garlands, mistletoe, and songs about stars. Kings lit fires said to burn. The past year away, queens embroidered wishes into the hems of winter gowns. The night of the winter solstice was long and dark, and yet every palace waited for that moment just before dawn when a single candle was placed in the window, not to keep time, but to welcome it back. Spring's call, time of seeds and pilgrims when the ground softened. A different rhythm began. The royal gardens stirred. The orchard's buds were watched daily, not by gardeners alone, but by stewards, cooks, and even scholars. The blossoming of the plum tree marked the queen's first walk of the year, the first crocus. Time to clean the chapel. Spring was also the season of pilgrimage. Kings and nobles travelled, not just to holy places, but to remind time that had passed. Shrines were visited, blessings were received, sins confessed, shoes worn thin in the absence of watchers. Pilgrimage was how royalty felt the weight of weeks. A journey out, a moment at a sacred stone, a quiet return, time written in footprints. Summer's crown, time of feast, and fire summer did not sneak in. It announced itself with the Feast of St. John, celebrated by fire, torch processions, bonfires, wheels of flame rolled down hills in royal courts. This was the season of public time, tournaments, royal progresses, outdoor meals. Everything was larger, louder, longer. Time was measured in sunlight, court. Painters studied its angle to cast halos. Court. Tailors timed stitches to shade. And the royal physician. He warned against too much heat, too much wine, too much motion. The king must rest 2 candle marks after sun's peak, one wrote. Because even summer, bold as it was, could overrun its clock. Autumn's fade, time of harvest, and Hallas the leaves browned. The royal world turned inward. Autumn was time for reaping and reckoning. Accounts were closed. Harvest tallies were drawn. Old debts forgiven or remembered. The Michaelmas feast marked the angel's descent, and often the king's softest speeches. Time was not watched in autumn. It was felt in the scent of apples, in the sound of distant geese, in the queen's decision to wear darker silk. By late autumn, the palace steward began lighting fires at an earlier candle mark, not because the clock said so, because the light said so, because the servants, shivering in hallways, said so. Saints, stars, and omens. The other royal calendars, there were calendars within calendars. The Saints' Day calendar, observed by piety and politics alike. The astrological calendar, tracked by court magicians and star readers. The omen calendar, not written but collected, crow feathers, dreams, illnesses, miscarriages. One queen refused to hold court on Tuesdays. After a comet was seen on a Tuesday, one king rose only after the 6th. Bell after a bad dream, even if it meant delaying meetings. In Poland, some kings counted time in boar hunts. In Burma, queens received astrologers with bowls of water and watched. How cinnamon floated. All of it was time. All of it mattered. The tapestry of time in royal halls. Long tapestries hung depicting the months. January, seated by a fire. February, pruning vines. March, sowing seeds. April, gathering blossoms. May, lovers in gardens. June, falconers afield. July, shearing sheep. August, threshing grain. September, crushing grapes. October, plucking fruit. November, slaughtering pigs. December, feasting indoors. These images taught even royal children how to see the year. They could not read the sun, but they could read the needle's memory, and as they aged, they recognized time not by clock, but by stitch. The royal dream. Time night. Time softened further. Kings dreamt not of days but of cycles. The return of an heir. The pattern of a comet, the repeating sound of a gate latch. Queens whispered their fears not to God, but to pillows, the ticking heart, the fading scent, the worry that too many winters had. Passed without telling them something new, the echo that remains today. Royal clocks are loud, they chime, they tick, they blink with numbers. But in a quiet hall, if you listen, you may still feel the old time. The shadow of the plum tree, the scent of beeswax candles, the song sung only when the leaves fall. These are clocks that need no winding. They return. Every year, every season, every hush they wait, without hurry, and tonight they wait with you. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. The next story sleeps just behind a velvet curtain, waiting to rise with the morning.